My billionaire roommate could have taken anyone to his family's charity gala. He chose me. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy heartfelt, emotional romance stories, please take a second to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our future videos. It is completely free. It only takes a moment, and your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories just like this one. We truly appreciate every single one of you. Also, let us know where you're watching from today by sharing your city or country in the comments below. We love seeing viewers from all around the world. Thank you so much for being here. And now, let's return to our story. The strangest thing about the richest man I ever met was that he never acted like he had anything to prove. That thought still crosses my mind every time I remember the morning everything changed. For almost 2 years, Adrian Calloway had been my roommate in a modest apartment just outside downtown Boston. And if you had met him back then, you never would have guessed he belonged to one of the wealthiest families in America. He paid his half of the rent on time, washed his own dishes, complained about how expensive eggs had become, and somehow managed to burn frozen pizza twice in the same month. I was an art teacher at a neighborhood community center, and my paycheck barely stretched far enough to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional coffee on Friday afternoons. Adrian always joked that my homemade pasta tasted better than anything at a 5-star restaurant, and every Tuesday night he insisted on doing the dishes because, according to him, the chef should never clean the kitchen. Looking back, I should have realized there was something unusual about him. Sometimes a black SUV would sit across the street for an hour before quietly driving away. Other times he would disappear for meetings wearing an ordinary navy suit that somehow looked like it had been tailored specifically for him. Whenever I asked what he actually did for a living, he would smile, shrug, and say, "Finance. It's less interesting than it sounds." Believed him because I had no reason not to. My own life was already complicated enough. The community art program where I taught children every afternoon had just received another budget warning. Our director gathered the staff that Monday morning and tried to sound optimistic, but I could see the worry in her eyes before she even spoke. Unless we found a major donor within 3 weeks, the center would have to close its doors. I smiled in front of my students anyway. Kids deserved encouragement, not adult problems. That afternoon we painted city skylines with watercolors, and one little boy proudly told me he wanted to become an architect someday because buildings made people feel safe. I carried those words home with me. When I unlocked the apartment door, Adrian was already there, standing in our tiny kitchen wearing rolled-up sleeves while unsuccessfully attempting to make grilled cheese sandwiches. The smell told me I had arrived about 30 seconds too late to save dinner. "Don't say it," he muttered without turning around. "I wasn't going to." I lied, trying not to laugh. "You were absolutely going to." I rescued the skillet before the bread surrendered completely, and within minutes we were eating simple sandwiches at our small kitchen table. It felt like every other evening we had shared together, comfortable and familiar, until Adrian grew unusually quiet. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned carrying a long black garment bag and a small envelope with my name written across the front in neat handwriting. He placed both on the table between us, looked directly into my eyes and said, "Lucas, I need you to come with me tomorrow night." I stared at the garment bag for several seconds before looking back at Adrian, convinced he had to be joking. He was standing there with the same calm expression he wore whenever he reminded me to buy more coffee or insisted that my plants were secretly judging me for forgetting to water them. Nothing about his face suggested this was some elaborate prank. I picked up the envelope, opened it carefully, and found a thick cream-colored invitation embossed with silver lettering. Even before I finished reading the first line, my stomach tightened. The Calloway Family Annual Charity Gala. I looked up so quickly that I almost dropped the card. "Calloway?" I asked. Adrian nodded once. "As in your family?" Another quiet nod. I laughed because it felt like the only reasonable response. "You have been living in this apartment, eating burned grilled cheese sandwiches, and borrowing my extra phone charger. And you forgot to mention that your family owns one of the largest companies in the country?" He rubbed the back of his neck and actually looked embarrassed. "It never seemed important." "Not important?" I could not stop smiling in disbelief. Most people would put that in the first 5 minutes of a conversation. That is exactly why I did not. His answer was so simple that it caught me off guard. He sat across from me at our tiny kitchen table, the same table we had assembled together after realizing neither of us understood furniture instructions. I wanted one place where people saw me before they saw my last name. I looked around our apartment. The scratched cabinets. The old refrigerator that hummed louder than it should. The stack of art supplies beside the couch that I kept promising to organize. Somehow the room suddenly felt different. Not because it had changed, but because I realized Adrian had chosen it on purpose. So why me? I finally asked. You could bring anyone to this gala. He held my gaze without hesitation. I know. I waited for him to continue, but he simply smiled. That is not an answer, I said. It is the only one I am ready to give tonight. The next afternoon I opened the garment bag and found the nicest tuxedo I had ever seen. It fit perfectly, as if someone had measured me weeks earlier without my knowledge. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror adjusting the bow tie for nearly 10 minutes before Adrian quietly stepped behind me. Here, he said. His hands moved confidently, straightening the knot with practiced precision. There. Much better. For one brief second, we both looked at our reflections instead of each other. Then he stepped back as though he had suddenly remembered the distance he normally kept. We rode downtown in a black sedan that was waiting outside our building. As the city lights reflected against the windows, my phone buzzed with a message from the director of the community center thanking me for refusing to give up on the children even though our future remained uncertain. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a slow breath. Adrian noticed. Everything all right? He asked. I forced a small smile. Just thinking about work. He nodded thoughtfully before saying, Tonight, do not worry about anything except being yourself. A few minutes later the car turned through enormous iron gates, and beyond them stood the largest estate I had ever seen. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, television cameras pointed toward the entrance, and elegantly dressed guests filled the marble steps. As the driver opened my door, I whispered, almost to myself, I do not belong here. Adrian offered me his hand, his expression steady and reassuring. Lucas, he said softly, the only person whose opinion matters tonight is mine. Come with me. I had seen impressive buildings before, but nothing prepared me for the Callaway estate. The front entrance alone looked larger than the entire community center where I spent most of my weekdays teaching children how to turn blank paper into something meaningful. Crystal chandeliers glowed through towering windows, perfectly trimmed gardens stretched across the property, and a string quartet played softly as guests walked up the marble staircase. Every person seemed to know exactly where to stand, exactly how to smile, and exactly which powerful hand to shake. Meanwhile, I was trying to remember whether I had accidentally left the apartment lights on. As soon as Adrian stepped out of the car beside me, the atmosphere changed. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Conversations paused. Several guests immediately turned toward him with practiced smiles that somehow looked rehearsed instead of genuine. I instinctively took half a step backward, hoping to disappear into the background, but Adrian glanced over his shoulder and waited until I caught up. Without saying a word, he slowed his pace so we walked side by side. It was a small gesture, yet it settled my nerves more than any reassuring speech could have. Inside the grand ballroom, everything sparkled. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, decorated with hand-painted murals and elegant lighting that reflected across polished floors. Waiters carried silver trays filled with delicate appetizers that looked too beautiful to eat. I quietly admitted to Adrian that I had no idea what half of them were. He smiled and whispered, Neither do I. That is why I usually eat before these events. I laughed, and for a brief moment the room felt less intimidating. Then the introductions began. Business executives greeted Adrian with enthusiastic handshakes. Philanthropists praised recent company achievements. Public officials thanked him for attending. Every conversation ended with curious eyes shifting toward me. And who is this? They would ask. Adrian never hesitated. This is Lucas Bennett. Nothing more, nothing less. He never described me as his roommate, his guest, or his friend. He simply spoke my name with quiet confidence, as though it should already mean something. The mystery only made people more curious. As we continued through the ballroom, I noticed enormous photographs displayed around the walls featuring smiling children, families, and community projects supported by the Callaway Foundation. At first they seemed inspiring, but the longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. The photographs focused almost entirely on hardship instead of hope. They showed sad faces much more often than joyful ones. They invited sympathy, but not understanding. I could not stop thinking about my students back at the community center. They deserve to be known for their imagination, their talent, and their dreams, not simply for the challenges they faced. Before I could share that thought with Adrian, an elegant woman approached us wearing a warm smile that immediately softened the formal atmosphere. She looked at Adrian with unmistakable affection before turning her attention to me. "You must be Lucas," she said kindly. "I have been hoping to meet the person who finally convinced my son to bring someone special to this gala." I blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. Adrian did not correct her. Instead, he offered a small smile that revealed nothing at all. His mother's eyes moved between us, clearly noticing my confusion and his unusual silence. Before either of us could say another word, a photographer called out from across the ballroom, asking us to look toward the cameras together. Adrian instinctively stepped closer to me, and as the flashes filled the room, I had the unmistakable feeling that one unexpected photograph was about to change far more than either of us had planned. The camera flashes seemed endless, and every burst of light made me feel more out of place. I had spent years encouraging shy children to believe they belonged wherever their talent could take them, yet standing in that ballroom, I was struggling to believe my own advice. As soon as the photographer lowered his camera, several reporters gathered nearby, whispering to one another while checking their phones. It did not take long before I realized why. The photograph of Adrian standing close beside me had already begun circulating among the guests. People smiled politely as they walked past us, but curiosity followed in every glance. I leaned closer to Adrian and quietly asked, "Do they always react like this?" He let out a slow breath before answering, "No. They are reacting because I have never brought anyone with me before." I stared at him, unsure whether that answer made me feel better or worse. Before I could ask another question, a television reporter approached us with a practiced smile and a microphone. "Mr. Callaway," she said warmly, "our viewers have been wondering who your guest is tonight. Would you like to introduce him?" I instinctively looked toward Adrian, expecting him to explain that I was simply his roommate. Instead, he answered with complete calm, "This is Lucas Bennett." The reporter smiled even wider. "Someone very important, I assume?" Adrian met her eyes without hesitation. "Very important." That was all he said. It was not a lie, but it certainly was not the clarification I had expected. Within minutes, conversations around the ballroom shifted. I caught fragments as guests walked by. "That must be him. I heard they have been together for a while." No wonder Adrian refused every introduction his family arranged. My face grew warm with embarrassment. "You know they all think we are." I lowered my voice before finishing the sentence. "A couple." Adrian remained surprisingly composed. "I know. Should we correct them?" He looked across the ballroom toward a group of board members speaking with his father. "Not yet." I frowned. "Why not?" His expression became more serious than I had ever seen. "Tonight is about raising money for programs that help thousands of people. If the press turns this evening into speculation about my personal life because I suddenly deny every rumor, the mission of this event disappears behind headlines." I knew enough about the media to understand he was probably right, even if I did not like it. "So we just let everyone believe whatever they want?" He gave me an apologetic smile. "Only until tonight is over." Before I could decide whether I agreed, soft music began filling the ballroom. The master of ceremonies announced the opening dance and invited guests to join the floor. Couples stepped forward almost immediately, filling the polished marble with graceful movement. I quietly stepped backward, hoping no one would notice me slipping away. Adrian gently reached for my hand, stopping me before I had taken more than a single step. "Dance with me," he said. I looked around in disbelief. "I do not know how." A faint smile crossed his face. "Neither did I the first time." My heart was beating much faster than it should have been as he guided me toward the center of the ballroom. His hand rested respectfully against my shoulder, while mine settled lightly against his arm, careful and uncertain. "Just follow me," he said softly. As we moved through the first few measures of music, the crowd around us slowly disappeared from my thoughts. For those few moments, there were no cameras, no reporters, and no whispered assumptions. There was only the quiet rhythm of the orchestra and the unexpected realization that standing beside Adrian somehow felt far more natural than standing anywhere else in that enormous room. Then, just as I finally relaxed, a deep voice echoed from behind us. "Adrian," the man said firmly, "we need to have a conversation. Now." I turned and immediately recognized the resemblance. Without anyone introducing him, I knew I was looking directly at Adrian's father. Adrian's father did not raise his voice, yet the entire conversation around us seemed to fade the moment he spoke. There was a quiet authority about him that came from decades of being obeyed without question. He offered me a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes before turning back to Adrian. "Would you excuse us for a moment?" Adrian looked at me first instead of answering him. "I will be right back," he said calmly. "Please stay here." I nodded, even though I suddenly felt like the only person in the ballroom without a place to stand. As they disappeared into a nearby hallway, I wandered toward one of the displays featuring projects funded by the foundation. Beautiful photographs covered the walls, accompanied by carefully written stories about lives that had supposedly been transformed through generosity. Guests admired the displays while servers continued offering elegant desserts and sparkling drinks. Everything looked flawless, yet something about it felt strangely distant. The people in the photographs seemed to exist only as symbols instead of individuals. They were presented as problems that had been solved rather than human beings with dreams of their own. I found myself thinking about the children from my art classes. Emma wanted to become an illustrator. Caleb dreamed of designing skyscrapers. Sophia loved painting sunsets because they reminded her that every difficult day eventually ended. None of those dreams could fit into a single photograph hanging on a ballroom wall. "You must be Lucas." I turned to find a distinguished gentleman wearing an expensive tuxedo and a warm smile. "I am Richard Evans," he said, extending his hand. "I serve on the foundation board." We shook hands, and he glanced toward the hallway where Adrian had disappeared. "He speaks highly of you." I blinked in surprise. "He does." Richard chuckled softly. "More than you realize." Before I could ask what he meant, another voice interrupted us. "Lucas Bennett?" I turned again to see Adrian's father approaching alone. His expression remained composed, but there was an unmistakable seriousness in his posture. "Would you mind walking with me for a moment?" Every instinct told me to refuse, yet doing so would have created an unnecessary scene. We stepped onto a quiet terrace overlooking the gardens, where the sounds of the orchestra became distant. He folded his hands behind his back before speaking. "My son has always surprised people," he said evenly. "Tonight is no exception." I waited patiently, sensing that he had not brought me outside to exchange pleasantries. "You work at a community art center," he continued. "I have already asked someone to verify your organization. It appears you are facing significant financial difficulties." My heart skipped. I had never mentioned that to anyone at the gala. "How did you know?" He ignored the question. "The amount your center needs is insignificant compared to what this family donates every year." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. "I could authorize full funding before this evening ends." For one hopeful second, all I could picture were my students laughing in the classroom again. Shelves full of fresh paint, new brushes, and another year of opportunities that they desperately deserved. Then he quietly added, "There is only one condition." I looked from the document back to his face. "After tonight, you disappear from Adrian's life." No interviews. No explanations. No future contact. You accept the donation, and everyone walks away with exactly what they need. I stared at the paper in his hand, knowing that the future of dozens of children rested only a few inches away, while somewhere inside the ballroom, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding beneath the evening sky, Adrian was still looking for me. I looked at the document for what felt like an eternity, even though only a few seconds had passed. My mind filled with images of my students painting at worn wooden tables, carefully saving every last drop of watercolor because we could not always afford new supplies. I imagined the community center staying open, the classrooms full of laughter instead of empty chairs, and every child who believed they finally had a place where someone noticed their talent. The offer in front of me could make all of that happen. It could solve every financial problem we had been fighting for months. Adrian's father remained perfectly calm, as though he had already calculated every possible outcome before inviting me onto the terrace. "This is not personal," he said. "Sometimes responsible decisions require sacrifice." I slowly lifted my eyes to meet his. "You are asking me to disappear from someone's life in exchange for money." His expression did not change. "I am asking you to recognize that you and Adrian belong in different worlds." I looked back at the folded agreement in his hand and quietly asked, "If your foundation truly believes in helping people, why does helping my students come with conditions?" For the first time, he hesitated. Only for a moment, but I noticed it. "Resources must be invested wisely," he answered. I took a slow breath before gently pushing the document back toward him. "The children I teach deserve support because they have dreams worth investing in, not because I agree to become part of a business arrangement." He studied me carefully, perhaps expecting me to change my mind. Instead, I smiled politely. "If the only way to save our community center is by selling my integrity, then I would be teaching those children the wrong lesson." Without another word, I turned and walked back toward the ballroom. My heart felt unbelievably heavy because I had just walked away from the one opportunity that could have guaranteed our future. Even so, something inside me knew I had made the only decision I could live with. As I reached the entrance, I heard familiar voices just beyond the open doors. Adrian was standing only a few feet away, speaking with one of the event organizers. Before I could call his name, I heard him ask, "Has anyone seen Lucas?" Relief washed over me, but before I could step forward, another organizer approached him carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Calloway, the foundation board would like you on stage in 5 minutes." Adrian nodded distractedly, still searching the room. At that exact moment, one of the volunteers hurried toward me. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked. "Someone from the program committee would like to speak with you." Confused, I followed her into a nearby conference room where several event planners were gathered around a presentation display. One of them smiled brightly when I entered. "We just reviewed your background," she said. "Your community art program is inspiring. We thought it would be wonderful to feature it during tonight's fundraising presentation." Before I could process what she meant, another volunteer added, "We have already prepared a short introduction about the children and their struggles. After the video plays, we would love for you to come on stage and encourage guests to donate." She handed me a printed copy of the speech they expected me to read. I glanced down at the first paragraph, and my chest tightened. Every sentence described the children as helpless, unfortunate, and broken. Their talents, their creativity, and their determination were nowhere to be found. They had been reduced to nothing more than a collection of sad stories designed to inspire larger donations. I slowly lowered the pages, knowing with absolute certainty that I could never stand in front of those families and describe them that way, even if refusing meant risking everything we had left. When the event coordinator asked whether I was ready, I smiled politely and said I needed just 1 minute. She seemed relieved, assuming I was rehearsing the speech they had written for me. The truth was I was trying to figure out how to stand in front of a ballroom filled with influential people without betraying the children who trusted me every afternoon. Moments later, the lights dimmed, and a carefully produced video appeared across the enormous screens. Soft piano music played while photographs of children flashed one after another beside words like hardship, struggle, and despair. Around me I heard quiet sighs of sympathy, but all I could think about was how none of those children would recognize themselves in that presentation. They were not defined by what they lacked. They were defined by what they created every single day with courage, imagination, and hope. My name was announced, and applause filled the ballroom as I walked toward the stage. The prepared speech rested in my hand, but before reaching the microphone I folded the pages once, set them on the podium, and looked across the audience. Hundreds of faces waited for me to continue the script they expected. Instead, I took a slow breath and spoke from my heart. "Thank you for caring enough to be here tonight," I began. "But I cannot read the speech that was written for me because it tells only half the story." The room became noticeably quieter. The children at my community center are not projects to be rescued. They are artists, musicians, future architects, teachers, engineers, and dreamers. They do not walk into my classroom asking for pity. They walk in asking for paintbrushes, blank paper, and someone who believes they can become more than the circumstances they were born into. I notice people lowering their phones and giving me their full attention. One of my students once told me that drawing buildings made him feel safe because someday he wanted to build homes where families could laugh together. Another little girl paints sunsets because she says every difficult day deserves a beautiful ending. Those children are not waiting for someone to save them. They are working every day to build their own futures. What they need from us is opportunity, respect, and the chance to be seen for who they are instead of what they have survived. For several long seconds, the ballroom was completely silent. Then applause began from one table, then another, until nearly everyone in the room was standing. I caught sight of Adrian near the front of the audience. His expression held something I had never seen before, not surprise, but quiet pride. Before I could continue, one of the event directors hurried toward the side of the stage and whispered urgently to a technician. My microphone suddenly went silent. I tapped it once, assuming it had malfunctioned, but nothing happened. Confused murmurs spread across the ballroom. Then, before anyone else could react, Adrian calmly stood. From his seat, walked directly onto the stage, picked up a second microphone from the presenter stand, and placed it gently into my hand. He turned to face the audience instead of me. "If tonight is truly about giving people a voice," he said clearly, "then the last person we should silence is the one telling us the truth." Every conversation stopped. Across the ballroom, I saw Adrian's father slowly rise from his chair, his expression unreadable, while Adrian remained standing beside me, making it unmistakably clear that this time he had chosen not his family's expectations, but his own. The applause continued long after Adrian lowered his microphone, but I could already feel the atmosphere changing. This was no longer just another elegant charity gala where generous donations were announced beneath crystal chandeliers. Something honest had entered the room, and honesty has a way of making even the most confident people uncomfortable. Adrian's father slowly approached the stage with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to solving every problem through authority. The ballroom fell completely silent as he stopped a few feet away from us. I expected another confrontation, another attempt to control the evening, but instead he simply looked at his son. "You have embarrassed this family," he said quietly. Adrian did not look away. "If telling the truth embarrasses us, then perhaps the truth is not the problem." A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. For the first time all evening, I saw uncertainty in the faces of executives, board members, and investors who had probably never imagined anyone would challenge the Callaway family so openly. Adrian took one slow step forward. "For years we have measured success by the size of our donations," he continued. "Perhaps it is time we measure success by whether the people we claim to help actually have a voice in the decisions that affect their lives." He turned toward the audience. "Beginning tonight, I will establish an independent advisory council for the Callaway Foundation. Teachers, community leaders, social workers, and the families we serve will have seats at that table. Philanthropy should not happen to communities. It should happen with them." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Richard Evans rose from his chair and began applauding. One by one, other board members joined him until the ballroom was once again filled with applause, louder than before because this time it was not celebrating wealth. It was celebrating courage. Adrian's father looked around the room, realizing that the decision had already escaped his control. Without another word, he nodded once, turned, and quietly walked away. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversations I barely remember. Guests approached to thank me for speaking honestly. Several educators introduced themselves and offered support for our community center. One family quietly promised to visit our program the following week before making any donation because, as they explained, they wanted to understand the children instead of simply reading about them. It was exactly the kind of response I had hoped for. Yet despite everything that had happened, one thought refused to leave my mind. Adrian had sacrificed far more than I had. His relationship with his family would never be the same after tonight. As the gala finally came to an end, I slipped outside without saying goodbye. The cool night air felt easier to breathe than the polished perfection inside the ballroom. I walked down the long driveway toward the front gate, convinced that leaving quietly was the kindest thing I could do. If I disappeared now, perhaps Adrian could still repair what had been broken. I had almost reached the sidewalk when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Lucas," Adrian called. I stopped but did not turn around immediately. When I finally faced him, he was slightly out of breath, his tuxedo jacket draped over one arm. No cameras following, no reporters watching, just the same man who used to burn grilled cheese sandwiches in our tiny apartment kitchen. I looked at him with a heavy heart and quietly said, "I am sorry. Tonight cost you more than I ever wanted it to." Adrian smiled gently, shook his head and replied, "Lucas, you still do not understand. Tonight did not cost me my future. Tonight gave it back to me." Adrian stood in front of me beneath the quiet glow of the estate's front lights, looking nothing like the polished air everyone had admired inside. He looked relieved. That was the first thing I noticed. Relief, not regret. I searched his face for even the smallest sign that he wished the evening had ended differently, but all I found was peace. "Your father offered to save my community center," I admitted softly. "He said all I had to do was disappear from your life." Adrian lowered his eyes for a moment before letting out a slow breath. "I thought he might." I frowned. "You knew." "I knew he would try to solve the situation the only way he understands. He believes every problem has a price." He looked back at me with the same steady expression that had made our tiny apartment feel like home long before I knew his last name. "You said no, did you not?" I nodded. "It was difficult." "I know." There was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. "Thank you." I laughed quietly, almost in disbelief. "You are thanking me after everything that happened tonight?" Adrian smiled. "Lucas, do you remember our first week as roommates?" I thought for a moment before laughing again. "You nearly flooded the kitchen because you thought the garbage disposal was broken." "It was broken." "No. There was a spoon in it." He shook his head with a grin. "You came home, fixed it in 30 seconds, and then asked whether I had eaten dinner. You did not know my last name. You did not know my bank account. You only cared whether I had remembered to eat." His smile slowly faded into something more sincere. "That happened every week after that. If I worked late, you left food in the refrigerator. If I looked exhausted, you made coffee before I asked. When I caught the flu, you canceled your weekend plans to buy medicine and groceries. You never treated me like an investment or an opportunity. You treated me like a person." My eyes drifted toward the mansion behind us, where lights still shined through the tall windows. "There were hundreds of people inside who would have gladly walked through those doors with you tonight." Adrian nodded. "There always are. Many of them are smarter than I am. Perhaps more successful. Some are more comfortable in your world." He smiled gently before answering the question I had been carrying in my heart since the invitation arrived. "Lucas, they wanted to stand beside Adrian Calloway. You were the only person who wanted to stand beside the man who burned grilled cheese sandwiches in a tiny apartment kitchen." I felt every wall I had carefully built around my heart begin to disappear. He stepped a little closer, leaving enough space for me to decide whether to close the distance. I did. We embraced quietly beneath the night sky while the sounds of the gala faded into the background. It was not a grand public moment. It was simply two people choosing honesty over appearances. 6 months later, our apartment looked exactly the same. The refrigerator still hummed too loudly. My art supplies still occupied one corner of the living room. Adrian still claimed my homemade pasta was better than any expensive restaurant, and I still laughed every time he reached for the dish soap before I could stop him. The community center remained open, supported by new donors who had visited our classrooms before contributing because they wanted to know the children, not just their stories. The Callaway Foundation introduced its new advisory council, giving educators, families, and community leaders a genuine voice in every major decision. Adrian attended the first meeting as a listener instead of the person giving instructions. One evening, as we carried groceries up the stairs to our apartment, I asked him a question that had stayed with me ever since that unforgettable gala. Do you ever miss the life everyone expected you to live? Adrian unlocked the door, smiled at our little kitchen, and quietly answered, No, because for the first time, I am living the life I chose. And every time I come home, I remember that the greatest gift anyone ever gave me was never money, influence, or success. It was being loved before anyone knew my last name.